Hello, my dear listeners. Today I want to start with a special thank you to 3 amazing women who left such kind comments. Malin Dalton from Warrnambool, Australia, Stella Rubin from California, and Karen Lindsay from Manchester, United Kingdom. It's truly wonderful to see how far our stories are reaching around the world. And what about you? Have you told me where you're listening from? Leave a comment below. I love finding out where all the hearts that follow this channel are from. And who knows, maybe your name will be featured in the next video too. Now then, let's begin today's story. Hazel Collins gripped the handle of the shopping cart so tightly her knuckles were white. The fluorescent lights of the suburban grocery store seemed aggressively bright, reflecting off the polished linoleum floor and amplifying the tinny Christmas music playing overhead. She was supposed to be feeling festive, but all she felt was a cold, creeping dread. She held her phone pressed to her ear, trying to navigate the crowded aisle while simultaneously listening to her mother's cheerful, yet subtly manipulative voice. "Oh, darling, your cousin Tiffany's wedding photos are just divine. She looks so happy. And she's only 22, imagine. It just makes a mother wonder, doesn't it?" Hazel's heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic physiological response to the familiar, invisible pressure. She knew exactly where this conversation was going. She was 27, a successful corporate lawyer, and the only thing she had managed to successfully commit to in the last 5 years was her quarterly billable hours. "Mom, I'm happy for Tiffany, truly," Hazel said, forcing a calm she didn't feel. She steered the cart around a display of holiday eggnog. "But I'm just picking up a few things before I drive up to the farm. I have a lot of work to clear before the holiday break." "Of course, dear. Just remember, your Aunt Carol and Aunt Susan will be there. They've already asked me if you're bringing anyone this year. I just told them you were too busy saving the world, but they do worry about you being alone." The words landed like small, sharp stones. Hazel felt a familiar wave of shame and frustration wash over her. It wasn't just her family. It was the entire expectation of her small hometown. She had built a fortress of success in the city, but every Christmas she returned to face the jury of her family, where her career achievements counted for nothing against the empty space beside her at the dinner table. She was so consumed by the impending interrogation, the questions about her love life, the pitying glances, that she failed to notice the man standing directly in front of her, examining a shelf of gourmet coffee. Her cart collided with his legs with a jarring thud. A cascade of canned goods, cranberry sauce, specialty olives, and a jar of pickled onions tumbled from the shelf, hitting the floor with a deafening metallic clatter. Hazel gasped, dropping her phone. The call disconnected. She stared at the mess, her carefully constructed composure shattering into 1,000 pieces. "Oh, I am so sorry," she breathed, scrambling to pick up a rolling can of olives. A hand, large and impeccably manicured, reached down to help her. "No harm done," the man said, his voice a low, easy rumble that seemed completely out of place amidst the chaos. Hazel finally looked up. He was tall, with rich brown hair and eyes the color of deep jade, currently crinkled at the corners with amusement. He wore a cashmere coat draped casually over a crisp white shirt, and he smelled faintly of expensive woodsy cologne and cold winter air. He was undeniably handsome in a way that made the grocery store seem like the set of a high-budget movie. "No, there is harm done," Hazel muttered, clutching the can of olives like a lifeline. She didn't mean to say it out loud, but the stress of the phone call and the collision had cracked her usual reserve. "This is exactly how my life is going right now. Everything is a mess, and I'm about to face a firing squad of well-meaning relatives who think my professional success is a cover for my tragic, lonely existence." She stopped, horrified at her impulsive confession to a complete stranger. She felt her cheeks flush crimson. The man simply smiled, a slow, genuine curve of his lips that reached his green eyes. He finished stacking the last of the cans. "A firing squad, you say?" he asked, his tone playful. He leaned against the shelf, crossing his arms, his gaze analytical, yet entirely focused on her. "And what exactly do they expect you to bring to this execution?" "A fiancé," Hazel confessed, the word escaping her in a tired sigh. Or at least a serious boyfriend. Someone to prove that I haven't completely sacrificed my personal life to the altar of corporate law. She expected him to laugh, or perhaps offer a sympathetic nod and walk away. Instead, a dangerous, thrilling glint entered his eyes. He seemed to be considering her predicament with genuine interest. He took a step closer, reducing the distance between them until Hazel could feel the faint warmth radiating from his body. The world outside their small, chaotic bubble of spilled olives and Christmas music seemed to fade. He lowered his voice, his tone dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was meant only for her ears, making her heart rate spike for an entirely different reason. "I have a proposition for you, Advocate Collins," he murmured. "My life has been dreadfully tedious lately. I need an adventure, and you, clearly, need a shield." He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle. "Take me. I will be your Christmas boyfriend." Hazel stared at him, her mind reeling. The audacity, the sheer, intoxicating madness of the suggestion. She opened her mouth to laugh, to dismiss the idea as absurd, but the look in his eyes, a look of serious, bored intent, stopped her. He was absolutely serious. "You're insane," she managed, her voice barely a breath. He shrugged, his easy confidence unwavering. "Perhaps, but think of the story. Think of the look on Aunt Carol's face." The image flashed in Hazel's mind. Aunt Carol's stunned silence, the immediate cessation of the pitying glances. It was a powerful lure. The thought of a week free from judgment, a week where she could simply pretend to be happy and settled, was almost irresistible. "What do you say?" he pressed, his smile widening. "A week of performance art, a Christmas miracle." Hazel felt a dizzying mix of panic and reckless abandon. She was a lawyer. She dealt in facts, logic, and control. But this man, this stranger, was offering her a temporary escape hatch from her own controlled life. "Fine," she whispered, the word a sudden, shocking commitment. "I accept." A triumphant, dazzling light filled his eyes. He extended his hand, not for a handshake, but to gently take the can of olives from her trembling fingers. "Excellent," he said. "The name is Brandon." Hazel felt a wave of cold realization wash over her, a sudden, terrifying panic that tightened her chest. "Wait," she stammered, looking at the handsome stranger who was now her fake boyfriend for the most important week of the year. "Brandon. What? I don't even know your last name." Hazel's office was a sanctuary of logic and order, a stark contrast to the chaos of the grocery store. She paced the length of her expensive Persian rug, the typed contract clutched in her hand. She was rationalizing the madness. This was a temporary, transactional agreement, and as an attorney, she needed to define the terms. The air conditioning felt too cold on her skin, but it was the only thing keeping the feverish impulse of the day before in check. A sharp rap on her glass door announced his arrival. Brandon entered, and the temperature of the room immediately shifted. He was impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that looked tailored to the millimeter, moving with the silent, purposeful grace of a predator who knew he owned the space. The faint woodsy scent of his cologne, the sensory anchor of their absurd agreement, preceded him. He spotted the contract in her hand, and a slow, amused smile spread across his face. "A contract," he observed, leaning against the edge of her mahogany desk. "I should have known. You're trying to put a legal fence around a perfectly spontaneous act of holiday desperation." "It's called due diligence, Brandon," Hazel retorted, trying to sound professional, but her voice held a slight tremor. "This is a serious commitment of time and emotional energy. We need clauses for confidentiality, reimbursement of expenses, and most importantly, clear boundaries." He picked up the document, his green eyes scanning the dense legal text. He chuckled, a deep sound that resonated in the quiet office. "You've even included a penalty for unauthorized public displays of affection," he noted, looking up at her with a glint of challenge. "You really don't like fun, do you, Advocate Collins?" I like control, Hazel corrected, meeting his gaze, and I like knowing the rules of the game. Fair enough, he conceded, dropping the contract back onto the desk. I'm a tech entrepreneur. I sold my last company 5 years ago and have been trying to invent new ways to be bored ever since. I understand the need for structure, even in absurdity. He paused, his expression turning serious, analytical. However, I have 2 non-negotiable terms of my own. Consider them my counter clauses. Hazel felt her heart begin to beat faster. She was ready for financial demands, but his intensity suggested something else entirely. The first, Brandon stated, pushing himself off the desk and taking a step toward her, reducing the charged space between them, is no prior research. Hazel frowned. I don't understand. No research into what? Into me, he clarified, his voice low. No Googling, no LinkedIn stalking, no asking mutual contacts about Brandon from the grocery store. I want this performance to feel real, Hazel. I want us to discover each other's fake history spontaneously. If you know everything about me, you'll be acting based on facts, not on the energy of the moment. It will ruin the fun, and it will ruin the performance. Hazel's internal reaction was a sharp spike of panic. Her entire life was built on research and preparation. This clause was a direct attack on her need for control, forcing her to rely on instinct. That's reckless, she whispered. That's the point, he countered, his eyes holding hers captive. He then delivered his second clause, the one that truly sealed the deal and defined the stakes. He returned to the desk and tapped the contract with his index finger. And the second is the fixed-term clause, he announced, his tone suddenly devoid of all playfulness. This arrangement is strictly temporary. It begins when we arrive at your family's farm, and it ends at the stroke of midnight on Christmas Day. No exceptions, no extensions, no regrets. The finality of his tone was a cold splash of water. It was a brutal reminder that this intoxicating connection, this shared recklessness, was merely a rental. The thought of the impending end date, even before they had begun, sent a strange, unexpected pang of loss through her. He needs this to end as much as I need it to start, she realized. He's protecting himself. Agreed, Hazel said, her voice firm, masking the turmoil inside. She signed the bottom of her copy of the contract. Brandon watched her, a flicker of something unreadable, perhaps respect, perhaps disappointment, in his eyes. He signed his own copy with a flourish. Now that the legalities are settled, Brandon said, retrieving his coat. He looked at her, his gaze dropping momentarily to her lips, a brief, silent acknowledgement of the tension that pulsed between them. We have one final, crucial detail to address before we hit the road, darling, he murmured, the term of endearment feeling dangerously natural. He picked up her overnight bag, which was waiting by the door. He paused, turning to face her, the charged space between them now humming with anticipation. Tell me, Advocate Collins, what is the utterly charming, completely believable and entirely fictional story of how we met? The luxurious black SUV, a vehicle that screamed urban elite, looked utterly out of place parked on the muddy gravel driveway of the Collins family farm. The air, crisp and cold, smelled of pine needles, wood smoke, and the rich, earthy scent of the countryside, a stark contrast to the polished steel and woodsy cologne of the man beside her. Hazel felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. She had traded her power suit for a thick, sensible sweater, but the armor of the city still felt necessary. Ready for the firing squad? Brandon asked, his voice low, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back as they approached the porch. The touch was a professional gesture of intimacy, a reminder of the performance, but it sent a confusing jolt of warmth through her. Just remember the story, Hazel whispered, adjusting the collar of his coat. We met at a gallery opening. I was admiring the art. You were admiring me. A classic, Brandon replied, a mischievous glint in his green eyes. I'll try to keep my admiration convincing. The front door burst open before they could knock. Hazel's mother, warm and round, enveloped her in a hug that smelled of cinnamon and home. "Oh, my baby is here, and you brought someone. You finally brought someone." Her mother's excitement was a palpable, overwhelming force. Then came the interrogation. Hazel's two aunts, Carol and Susan, formidable matriarchs in matching festive sweaters, descended upon Brandon. "Brandon, dear," Aunt Carol began, her voice dripping with skepticism. "So nice to finally meet the man who managed to pry our busy Hazel away from her important law career. What exactly do you do?" Brandon, the billionaire tech mogul, didn't flinch. He disarmed them with a smile that could melt glaciers. "I'm in technology, ma'am. I mostly manage investments and look for new opportunities. It's dreadfully dull, but it allows me the flexibility to chase after beautiful, brilliant women who work too hard." The aunts exchanged a look. His charm was working. He hadn't revealed his wealth, only his availability. "And how long have you two been together?" Aunt Susan pressed, her eyes narrowed. "Long enough to know I don't want to let her go," Brandon replied smoothly, pulling Hazel closer and pressing a soft kiss to her temple. The gesture was pure performance, yet Hazel felt a strange, genuine fluttering in her chest. Just as the aunt seemed ready to retreat, defeated by his charm, the true chaos erupted. A loud, high-pitched war cry echoed from the side of the house. Two small, identical figures, moving with the speed and coordination of trained military operatives, burst around the corner. These were Connor and Nolan, Hazel's 9-year-old twin nephews, the sons of her older sister, Nancy. They were a whirlwind of energy, wearing matching camouflage jackets and mischievous grins. "Aunt Hazel!" they shouted in unison. "Who's the new target?" Before Hazel could introduce Brandon, the twins executed their plan. They had been waiting. They had packed a snowball, not of soft, fluffy snow, but a dense, rock-hard ball of packed ice, perfectly camouflaged. Nolan hurled the icy missile. It was aimed with precision, not at Brandon's face, but at the crown of his perfectly coiffed, expensive brown hair. The impact was a surprisingly loud thwack. Hazel gasped, horrified. Her mother shrieked. The aunts looked on, scandalized. Brandon froze, a single drop of melted ice trickling down his temple. Hazel waited for the inevitable explosion. The irritation, the demand to leave, the end of the contract before it even began. This was, after all, a man who valued order and control. Instead, Brandon slowly turned to face the twins. He wiped the melted ice from his hair, a wide, genuine smile spreading across his face. He crouched down, bringing himself to their level. The transition from sophisticated CEO to playful conspirator was instantaneous. "Good job, agents," he said, his voice a low, approving rumble. "A solid hit, but a professional always checks the perimeter." He pointed to the roof of the porch. "If you had hit me from the roof line, you would have had better cover and a more surprising angle of attack." Connor and Nolan stared at him, their mouths agape, their initial triumph replaced by stunned admiration. Hazel watched the exchange, utterly bewildered. The man who was bored by his life was suddenly animated by a 9-year-old's prank. "Now," Brandon continued, his eyes glinting with a dangerous, thrilling light. "Where is the armory? I think it's time for a counterattack." He stood up, slinging an arm around Hazel's shoulders, his touch now feeling less like a shield and more like an anchor in the sudden, delightful chaos. "Come on, darling," he said, his voice full of genuine amusement. "Looks like we just arrived at the front lines." Hazel, watching the billionaire tech mogul being recruited by her mischievous nephews, felt a nervous, surprised laugh bubble up. The man who had described his life as dreadfully dull was having the time of his life. And the lawyer who craved control was suddenly, terrifyingly, enjoying the ride. The chaos of the arrival eventually subsided, replaced by the warm, buzzing noise of a large family settling in for the holidays. Hazel's sister, Nancy, led them to Hazel's childhood room, a space that, to Hazel's dismay, contained only one full-sized bed. "Sorry, guys," Nancy chirped, oblivious to the sudden spike in tension. "The farm is packed. You two lovebirds won't mind sharing, will you? Not at all, Brandon replied instantly, his voice smooth as silk, his hand giving Hazel's shoulder a reassuring professional squeeze. But once the door closed, the performance ended, and the reality of the situation hit them both. The room was small, decorated with faded posters of teenage rock bands and filled with the scent of old wood and lavender. The bed, though comfortable, suddenly seemed impossibly small. Hazel walked to the window, pulling the curtain back slightly. Okay, rules, she stated, her voice crisp and businesslike. Pillows down the middle, no crossing the line. And you sleep on the side closest to the door. I need the window. Agreed, Brandon said, already stripping off his suit jacket. He moved with an economical grace that made the small room feel even smaller. He folded the jacket meticulously and placed it on the only chair. The tension in the room was palpable, a thick, suffocating blanket of unspoken awareness. They were two highly controlled individuals forced into dangerous proximity. They settled into the bed, the pillows creating a flimsy, inadequate barrier. Hazel lay rigidly on her side, staring at the wall, acutely aware of the warmth radiating from the man just inches away. She could hear the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. You're tense, Advocate Collins, Brandon murmured into the darkness. I'm not used to sharing a bed with a complete stranger, she whispered back. Ah, but I'm not a complete stranger anymore, he corrected softly. I'm the man who was hit by a frozen snowball on your behalf. And you're the woman who confessed her deepest professional insecurity to me in a grocery store. Hazel sighed, the sound escaping her like a slow leak. It's just, I'm tired of the performance. The one I put on every day in the city. And now this one here. What are you performing in the city? He asked. The successful woman, she confessed, the darkness making the truth easier to admit. The one who is perfectly happy with her career, who doesn't need anything else. But sometimes, when I look at the chaos here, the genuine messiness of it all, I feel like I missed the point. Brandon was silent for a long moment. Hazel could feel him shift slightly, turning toward her. I know the feeling, he finally said, his voice dropping lower. My performance is the invulnerable man, the one who built an empire from nothing, who doesn't need people, who only deals in logic. I created my fortune to buy security, but all I bought was a very luxurious form of boredom. He paused. I had a hobby once, building things with my hands, not code but actual wood. I stopped when I realized I couldn't control the grain, the knots, too messy. Hazel felt a surprising surge of empathy. She knew that feeling, the fear of the uncontrollable. I used to draw, she admitted, her voice barely audible. Portraits, but I stopped when the lines weren't perfect. They lay in the darkness, two people defined by their need for control, sharing secrets that had nothing to do with their fake relationship and everything to do with their real fears. The air between them was now heavy, with a dangerous, shared vulnerability. Hazel felt her eyelids growing heavy. The tension in her shoulders began to ease. She was safe, not because of the pillows, but because of the honesty. As she drifted toward sleep, she shifted slightly, her hand accidentally flopping over the pillow barrier and resting lightly on the firm muscle of Brandon's chest. He didn't flinch. He didn't move. He simply whispered, his voice warm and close to her ear, a sound that was both a comfort and a warning. Good night, Advocate Collins. Hazel, half asleep, didn't pull her hand back. She felt the slow, steady beat of his heart beneath her palm, a rhythm that was strangely grounding. And she knew, with a terrifying certainty, that the rules of their contract were already beginning to blur. Hazel woke up not to the gentle sounds of a farm morning, but to the acrid smell of something burning and the high-pitched, gleeful shrieks of the twins. Her eyes snapped open. The spot where Brandon had been was empty, but the faint, familiar scent of his woodsy cologne lingered on the pillow beside her. She scrambled out of bed, pulling on a robe, her mind immediately racing to disaster scenarios. Fire? Sabotage? She burst into the kitchen, a whirlwind of professional panic. What she saw stopped her dead in her tracks. The kitchen, usually the domain of her mother's meticulous order, was a landscape of utter culinary chaos. Flour coated every surface like a fresh layer of snow. Her mother was laughing, a sound Hazel hadn't heard so freely in years, trying to wipe a smudge of chocolate from her apron. And in the center of the fray was Brandon. He was wearing a borrowed, oversized apron, his hair dusted white, his face smeared with flour, looking less like a billionaire and more like a happy, disheveled baker. He was engaged in a fierce yet joyous battle with Connor and Nolan, who were armed with spoons and bowls of cookie dough. "The key is misdirection, gentlemen," Brandon shouted, feigning a lunge at Nolan, only to use the distraction to flick a spoonful of dough at Connor's nose. "You can't just let them do this, Mom," Hazel exclaimed, her voice tight with disbelief. "It's a disaster. Look at the mess." Brandon turned, his flour-dusted face breaking into a wide, challenging grin. He looked at Hazel, the controlled, tense lawyer, and then back at the mess, his eyes sparkling with mischief. "She's right, Mrs. Collins," he said to her mother. "Your daughter is clearly suffering from a severe case of adultitis. She needs immediate aggressive intervention." Before Hazel could protest, Nolan, taking his cue from Brandon, scooped a handful of flour from the counter and launched it. Hazel ducked instinctively, but the flour cloud enveloped her. She sputtered, wiping the white powder from her eyes. The initial shock quickly morphed into a furious, unfamiliar impulse. Her control snapped. "Oh, you want a war?" she growled, grabbing the nearest weapon, a bag of powdered sugar, and tearing it open. What followed was a glorious, uninhibited few minutes of pure, childish abandon. Hazel, the meticulous lawyer, chased the twins around the table, pelting them with sugar. Brandon, laughing heartily, joined the fray, using a spatula as a shield. When the last of the sugar was thrown, they all collapsed onto the flour-coated floor, breathless and sticky, laughing until their sides ached. It was in that moment, lying amidst the ruins of the kitchen, that Hazel saw Brandon truly relax for the first time. The tension that usually held his shoulders rigid was gone. He looked genuinely, uncomplicatedly happy. The door swung open, and the two aunts, Carol and Susan, walked in, stopping dead at the sight of the white-coated carnage. Hazel braced herself for the inevitable lecture on decorum and cleanliness. Aunt Carol surveyed the scene, the flour, the laughter, the billionaire covered in cookie dough. And then, to Hazel's utter astonishment, she smiled. "Well, Brandon," Aunt Carol said, her voice warm. "It seems you're the first man who has managed to get the fight out of our Hazel and put the fun back in." Aunt Susan nodded in agreement. "He's good for her, isn't he, dear? He's so relaxed." Hazel watched the aunts retreat, their disapproval completely disarmed. She realized that Brandon, the stranger she had hired to solve her social problems, was succeeding not through his charm, but through his genuine ability to embrace the chaos she had always avoided. Brandon pushed himself up, offering Hazel a hand. As she stood, he gently brushed a clump of flour from her cheek. The touch was quick, intimate, and entirely unnecessary for the performance. Their eyes met. Brandon's gaze was no longer amused or analytical. It was filled with a warm, deep admiration. He wasn't looking at the successful lawyer. He was looking at the woman who had just engaged in a flour war. "That," Brandon murmured, his voice slightly rough, "was surprisingly liberating." Hazel's heart hammered against her ribs, a rhythm far more frantic than the one caused by her mother's phone calls. She was afraid, not of the mess, but of the realization blooming in her chest. She was starting to admire the man who had brought the chaos. Hazel woke with a start, the lingering scent of wood smoke from the fireplace mixing with the faint, familiar aroma of Brandon's cologne. She lay still, listening to the quiet sounds of the house settling. She sensed a disturbance beside her, not a physical movement but a deep, internal unrest. She carefully turned her head to look at Brandon. He was rigid, lying on his back, his brow furrowed. He was sweating, despite the cool temperature of the room. He wasn't awake, but he was clearly trapped in a silent, agonizing nightmare. He mumbled something low and inarticulate, a sound of pure distress. Hazel leaned closer, trying to decipher the words. Lose everything. The fire. Hazel's professional instincts kicked in. She reached out, her hand hovering over his arm, hesitant to break the spell of the nightmare. She chose to speak softly, gently. Brandon, wake up. You're safe. He snapped awake, his eyes wide and unfocused, filled with a raw, primal fear that made him look younger, stripped of his usual composure. He blinked rapidly, his breathing ragged, before his green eyes finally locked onto hers. The mask of the charming, bored entrepreneur was gone, replaced by a man utterly exposed. Hazel, he rasped, sitting up abruptly. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, trying to regain control. You were having a nightmare, she said, keeping her voice calm and even. Something about a fire. Brandon swung his legs out of the bed, putting immediate distance between them. He walked to the window, staring out at the dark, silent landscape, his posture stiff and defensive. It's nothing, he said, his voice clipped and cold, the familiar clinical tone returning. Just old memories. Hazel, however, refused to back down. She had seen the depth of his pain. She got out of bed and approached him slowly, respecting the physical space he had created, but not allowing him to retreat emotionally. The Tadio you talked about, she began softly. It's not just boredom, is it? It's a shield, a way to avoid feeling. He turned to face her, his jaw tight. He knew he couldn't lie. He had been caught in a moment of utter vulnerability. My family was wealthy, he confessed, his voice low and devoid of emotion, as if reading a sterile report. When I was 16, we lost everything. Not just the money. My parents, our home, in a fire. It was fast and total. He paused, the silence in the room heavy with the weight of his past. I built the company, the fortune, the life, all of it, to buy security, to ensure I would never be poor, never be dependent, never be vulnerable to loss again. I became obsessed with control. My life is meticulously organized, predictable, and yes, boring. He looked at her, his gaze intense. The only thing I can't control is the fire, the loss, and now, this. He gestured vaguely between them. The attraction, the messiness, the feelings you're making me have. Hazel was stunned by the depth of his confession. The invulnerable man had just revealed the catastrophic wound at the core of his being. He had built his empire not out of greed, but out of profound, paralyzing fear. She, the lawyer who valued control above all else, found herself acting purely on instinct and empathy. She closed the remaining gap between them and simply wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her head against his chest. It was not a gesture of passion or seduction. It was pure, unthinking comfort. Brandon froze. He was accustomed to being the strong one, the provider, the man who offered support. He was not used to receiving it. Slowly, tentatively, his arms came around her, holding her tightly. Hazel felt the frantic rhythm of his heart begin to slow against her ear. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling the soft, familiar scent of lavender and chamomile that anchored her essence. After a long moment, they separated, but remained close, the shared pain and comfort having forged a connection deeper than any contract. He reached up, his fingers gently tracing the curve of her cheek. The look in his eyes was a dangerous mix of gratitude and raw desire. I shouldn't have told you that, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. You're making me feel things I swore I would never feel again. Hazel, her own heart pounding a chaotic rhythm, didn't answer with words. She simply leaned in, closing the final inch between them, challenging the rule of the contract and the rule of his own life. The air crackled with the terrifying, beautiful possibility of what was about to happen. The next day, the atmosphere in the farmhouse was thick with the unspoken consequence of the previous night's intimacy. Hazel and Brandon maintained a careful distance, their interactions meticulously polite and functional. They were both desperately trying to rebuild the walls that Brandon's confession and Hazel's comforting embrace had shattered. The family, however, was oblivious to the internal turmoil. The day was dedicated to the chaotic, heartwarming tradition of decorating the massive, sprawling Christmas tree. Hazel, dressed in a simple pair of jeans and a comfortable, worn sweater, was relaxed in a way she never allowed herself to be in the city. She was laughing genuinely, directing the twins on where to hang the most precarious ornaments. Brandon watched her from the doorway of the living room. He saw the easy warmth in her eyes, the way she moved with a natural grace that was absent when she wore her lawyer's armor. He realized he was falling for this version of Hazel, the one who embraced the messiness of life, the one who drew portraits in her mind, the one who offered comfort without judgment. The climax of the tree decorating arrived, the placement of the star. As Nancy hoisted the twins onto a ladder to position the final ornament, Aunt Carol, the master manipulator, seized her opportunity. "Oh, look, everyone," she announced, her voice carrying over the festive din. "Mistletoe!" She held up a sprig of green leaves and berries, positioning herself strategically between Hazel and Brandon. "It's a tradition, dears," she trilled, pushing Hazel gently toward Brandon. "A little holiday cheer." Hazel's mind raced. "This is a performance. Keep it light. Keep it professional." Brandon stepped forward, his eyes locked on hers. He didn't look amused. He looked intense. The space between them, normally charged with unspoken tension, was now a live wire under the scrutiny of the entire family. He placed his hands on her waist, pulling her close. The contact was firm, possessive, and entirely for the benefit of the audience. "Don't worry," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. Just a quick peck for the crowd. But when his lips met hers, it was anything but quick or professional. The kiss started as a performance, a light, theatrical brush. But the moment their lips connected, the months of repressed tension, the shared vulnerability of the night before, the dangerous proximity, all exploded in a single, overwhelming surge. It was a kiss that demanded a response. It was deep, consuming, and utterly real. Hazel's hands instinctively went to his chest, clutching the soft fabric of his sweater. She tasted wood smoke and a hint of mint, and the intoxicating flavor of him, the sound of the family, the music, the chaos. It all faded into a distant hum. There was only the heat, the pressure, and the terrifying, breathtaking realization that this was not acting. When Brandon finally pulled back, they were both breathless. The air was thick and silent. The family was watching, but neither of them noticed. Hazel looked into his eyes, and the playful glint was gone. In its place was a raw, unguarded expression of shock and something far more terrifying, genuine affection. He had felt it too. The kiss had been a confession. The terrifying realization hit Hazel with the force of a physical blow. She had hired a fake boyfriend to avoid the pressure of her family. But in doing so, she had created a genuine, overwhelming problem for herself. She had fallen for the man she was contractually obligated to let go. Brandon, equally stunned, slowly released her waist. He looked at his own hands, then back at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of desire and self-reproach. The performance was over. The contract was broken, and the holiday was only half over. The aftermath of the kiss under the mistletoe was a suffocating silence that settled over the farmhouse like a thick fog. Hazel and Brandon avoided eye contact, communicating only through strained, overly polite exchanges. The genuine affection they had shared was now a dangerous, volatile secret. The family, however, interpreted the tension as the natural awkwardness of a deeply in-love, newly serious couple. The day progressed, leading to the tradition of opening the family gifts. Hazel's gifts were practical and thoughtful. A new mixer for her mother, a book for her father, and a set of high-tech headphones for the twins, who immediately tore into the packaging. Then came Brandon's turn. He handed Hazel a small, elegantly wrapped box. "I know the contract stipulates no extravagant gifts," he murmured, his voice low enough so only she could hear. "But this is technically a tool." Hazel opened the box. Inside was a leather-bound sketchbook of the highest quality, accompanied by a set of professional-grade charcoal pencils. It was a gift that spoke volumes. He remembered their quiet conversation in the dark, her confession about her abandoned passion for drawing. Tears welled up in Hazel's eyes. This gift was more meaningful than any diamond necklace could have been. It was proof that he had seen past the lawyer and connected with the girl she used to be, the girl she had buried under years of ambition. She looked up at him, her heart overflowing with a gratitude that was dangerously close to love. She knew she had to say something, anything, to re-establish the necessary distance. She took his arm and led him quickly into the empty hallway, away from the prying eyes of the family. "Brandon," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "This is too much. Thank you. Truly. But we need to talk about the kiss. And about this." She gestured vaguely between them. He looked at her, his expression guarded. "It was a mistake. A momentary lapse in judgment due to the holiday spirit." "No," Hazel insisted, shaking her head. "It was real. And that's the problem. I can't afford real, Brandon. I worked too hard for my life. I can't get distracted. I can't mix things up." She confessed her deepest fear, the one she had tried to bury with billable hours. "If I let myself feel this, I might lose control. I might decide that this, the chaos, the farm, the drawing, is more important than the career I built. And I can't risk that. We need to be careful to not mix things up too much." Brandon listened, his green eyes darkening with understanding, but also with a profound disappointment. He realized her fear of loss was just as paralyzing as his own. She was choosing the safety of her fortress over the danger of vulnerability. He took a step back, the physical distance mirroring the emotional wall she had just erected. His voice, when he finally spoke, was cool and professional, the mask of the invulnerable man firmly back in place. "Of course," he said, the word cutting through the festive air. "The contract is clear. The fixed-term clause is absolute. I was getting carried away by the performance. My apologies for the lapse." He looked at her, his gaze holding a silent, heartbreaking accusation. "Consider the terms reaffirmed, Advocate Collins. I was having too much fun. I will ensure that doesn't happen again." He turned and walked back toward the living room, leaving Hazel alone in the hallway, clutching the sketchbook. The gift, meant as a symbol of connection, now felt like a heavy, painful reminder of the beautiful, impossible thing she had just pushed away. The fixed-term clause was reaffirmed, but now it was enforced by pain, not by mutual agreement. The tension between Hazel and Brandon was now a sharp, visible thing. They spoke only when necessary, their dialogue clipped and formal, a stark contrast to the easy banter they had shared just days before. The rest of the family noticed the shift, interpreting it as the inevitable first fight of a serious relationship. The emotional strain, combined with the cold farm air, took its toll on Hazel. She woke up the next morning with a raw throat and a dull, throbbing headache. She tried to dismiss it, popping painkillers and attempting to join the family breakfast. Brandon, however, noticed immediately. His clinical eye, honed by years of analyzing data and assessing risk, zeroed in on her flushed cheeks and the slight tremor in her hands. "You have a fever," he stated, his voice devoid of emotion, yet carrying the authority of a diagnosis. "I'm fine," she insisted weakly, trying to sip her coffee. In a move that surprised everyone, Brandon took the cup from her hand. "You're not fine. You're running on fumes and stress. You need rest and hydration." He took charge with the same efficiency he would use to run a multi-million-dollar negotiation. He marched her back to the bedroom, ignoring her protests, and fetched a thermometer. 1015, he announced grimly. "Flu. Get under the covers. I'll be back." And for the rest of the day, the billionaire tech mogul became her hyper-efficient, reluctant nurse. He was brusque, his bedside manner entirely clinical, but his actions were undeniable. He brought her hot herbal tea, measured her medication doses precisely, and ensured she was comfortable. He canceled his plans to go into town, staying close, working on his laptop in the corner chair. He didn't offer comfort or kind words. He offered competence and care. Later that evening, as the house quieted down, Hazel felt a little better. The fever had broken, leaving her weak but clear-headed. She found Brandon on the back porch, wrapped in a thick blanket, staring out at the falling snow. The cold air seemed to suit him, providing the distance he craved. She approached him slowly, carrying 2 steaming mugs of hot chocolate. "The doctor is off duty," she said softly, handing him a mug. He took it, his fingers brushing hers, sending a familiar, unwanted jolt through her. "I was just fulfilling the terms of the contract," he said, his voice flat. "I can't have my fake girlfriend collapsing before the term is up. It would reflect poorly on my ability to manage resources." "Thank you, Brandon," she said, ignoring his cold dismissal. "You were very kind." A heavy silence settled between them, broken only by the gentle sound of the falling snow. Hazel knew he was avoiding the bedroom, avoiding the dangerous proximity. "You know," Hazel began, looking out at the white landscape, "my mother told me something earlier. She said she was relieved to see me with you. She said she was worried about how much I worked, but that she saw me alive and happy this week." Brandon remained silent, his gaze fixed on the distance. "She thought you were good for me," Hazel finished, her voice barely a whisper. He finally turned his head, his eyes meeting hers. The coldness was still there, but beneath it was a flicker of pain. "I'm not good for you, Hazel," he said, his voice rough. "I'm a complication. And you made it very clear you don't want complications." He stood up, pulling the blanket tighter around his shoulders. "I'm going to take a walk," he announced. "I need some air." He walked away, leaving her alone on the porch. Hazel watched his retreating figure disappear into the swirling snow. She realized, with a sickening certainty, that he wasn't just avoiding her, he was running away. He was terrified of the genuine connection they had shared, and he was using the cold, the contract, and the distance to protect himself from the vulnerability she had forced upon him. He had made his choice, and it hurt more than any fever could. Hazel watched Brandon disappear into the white expanse of the farm, the silence he left behind more deafening than any noise. She knew she couldn't let him retreat into his emotional fortress. The time for polite avoidance was over. She waited 10 minutes, allowing the cold to solidify her resolve, then followed his tracks in the fresh snow. She found him leaning against the fence line, staring at the empty fields, his posture rigid. She walked up beside him, the cold air stinging her lungs. She didn't touch him, respecting the physical boundary, but she stood close enough for him to feel her presence. "I need to apologize," she began, her voice steady despite the internal turmoil. He didn't look at her. "No need. You reaffirmed the contract. You chose control. It was logical." "It was fear," she corrected sharply. "When you gave me that sketchbook, you saw the part of me I buried, and that terrified me. My whole life has been about building a perfect, controlled environment. I thought success would bring happiness, but it only brought more work and more fear of losing it all." She took a deep breath, the cold air burning her throat. "I was afraid to admit that the life I built is empty. I was afraid to admit that the only time I've felt truly alive in years was here, covered in flour, or lying next to you in the dark." Brandon finally turned, his eyes searching hers, the coldness in his gaze slowly thawing under the heat of her honesty. "You said you were afraid of losing control," he murmured. "I was," Hazel admitted. "But I realized something when I was sick. You, the man who built an empire on control, didn't control me. You cared for me, You were impatient, clinical, but you were there. You didn't try to manipulate the situation. You just fixed the problem. She stepped closer, the space between them now humming with the electricity of truth. You told me your life was boring because you were avoiding pain. Well, my life is empty because I'm avoiding joy. I've been so focused on the risk of falling in love that I forgot the risk of living a life I don't love. She looked at him, her heart laid bare. You made me question everything, Brandon. And I need you to know that the kiss under the mistletoe wasn't a mistake. It was the most honest thing that happened to me all week. Brandon's eyes were intense, analytical, yet filled with a raw, undeniable emotion. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face, his gaze dropping to her lips. Hazel, he whispered, his voice thick with desire and conflict. If I kiss you again, the contract is over. Everything changes. You know that. I know, she breathed, leaning slightly into his touch. And I don't care. The air was charged, the moment stretched thin. He was inches away from closing the distance, from shattering the last vestiges of their agreement. Suddenly, a small, high-pitched voice cut through the silence. Mr. Brandon, Aunt Hazel, we found you. Connor and Nolan burst around the corner of the barn, their cheeks rosy from the cold, carrying a massive, dilapidated sled. We need your help, Nolan exclaimed, running up to Brandon. We can't get the sled up the hill, and we need a test pilot. Brandon froze, his hand dropping from Hazel's face. The intense moment was brutally, hilariously interrupted. He looked from the eager, innocent faces of the twins to Hazel's frustrated yet amused expression. He let out a long, slow breath, a mixture of relief and regret. The moment was gone. A test pilot, you say? Brandon asked, his voice regaining its playful edge. He looked back at Hazel, a silent message passing between them. Not now, but soon. Lead the way, gentlemen, he said, turning toward the hill. He walked away, leaving Hazel standing alone by the fence, her heart in a confusing, exhilarating turmoil. He had left her with the truth, and a question. He had made her question her entire life. Now she had to figure out the answer. The farmhouse was buzzing with anticipation. It was Christmas Eve, the final night of the contract. The air was thick with the scent of roasting turkey, mulled wine, and the underlying tension between Hazel and Brandon. They were both hyper-aware of the clock. Midnight would bring not only Christmas Day, but the abrupt termination of their relationship. They were acting with a desperate, forced cheerfulness, trying to make the final hours count, while simultaneously dreading the inevitable separation. During the feast, the family gathered around the large, rustic dining table. The wine flowed, the laughter was loud, and the atmosphere was genuinely warm. Hazel's father, a quiet, thoughtful man, stood up, tapping his glass with a spoon. Before we carve the turkey, he announced, his voice thick with emotion, I want to propose a toast. To family, and to the newest member of our family, Brandon. Brandon, sitting next to Hazel, stiffened. He was prepared for a toast, but not this level of emotional integration. Brandon, Hazel's father continued, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Thank you. Thank you for making our Hazel so happy. He paused, looking directly at his daughter. We love Hazel very much, but we worry. We worry that she works too hard, that she carries too much on her shoulders. We worried that she was forgetting how to live, but this week, she has been different. She has laughed more freely than I've heard her laugh in years. She has been messy, she has been silly, and she has been present. He raised his glass. Brandon, you have a good heart. You brought our girl back to us. Thank you for making her feel safe enough to be herself. The entire family raised their glasses, their eyes shining with genuine admiration for Brandon. Hazel looked at Brandon, whose usual composure had completely cracked. His eyes were wide, and a deep flush had risen on his neck. He was not used to being seen as a good man, or as someone who belonged. He was used to being the observer, The controller. The toast, meant to celebrate the performance, became the final, irrefutable exposure of the truth. Hazel and Brandon looked at each other, and the realization was mutual and devastating. The performance had become their reality. They were no longer faking it. The affection, the ease, the sense of belonging, it was all real. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed 11 times. 1 hour left. The family began to clear the table, moving into the living room for the final round of gift-giving. Hazel and Brandon lingered in the dining room, the silence between them heavy with the weight of the impending deadline. "Your father," Brandon began, his voice barely a whisper. "He thinks I'm a good man." "You are," Hazel affirmed simply. "You just hide it very well." He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. The touch was tender, a silent plea. "I don't want to go," he confessed, the words raw and honest. "I don't want to go back to the gray." "Then don't," Hazel pleaded, leaning into his touch. "We can talk. We can figure it out." The grandfather clock in the hall began its slow, deliberate chime. Dong, dong, dong. It was counting down the final seconds. Brandon snatched his hand away as if burned. The sound of the chimes was the sound of the contract being enforced. He had written the rule, and he would abide by it, even if it meant tearing his own heart out. He took a step back, his face a mask of pain and resolve. The final chime rang out, signaling the stroke of midnight. "Thank you, Hazel," he said, his voice thick with finality. It was the best Christmas. The silence of Hazel's high-rise apartment was deafening. It was the day after Christmas, and she was back in the city, back in her fortress of control. The scent of pine and wood smoke had been replaced by the sterile smell of polished marble and expensive leather. She sat at her massive mahogany desk, staring at a stack of legal briefs. The work, which had once been her anchor, now felt cold and meaningless. The pressure of billable hours, the complex clauses, the aggressive negotiations, it all seemed like a children's game compared to the raw, genuine chaos of the farm. She was back in her power suit, but the armor felt flimsy. Across the city, Brandon was equally adrift. He was in a board meeting, listening to a presentation on quarterly projections. The numbers were astronomical, the strategy flawless, but his mind kept replaying the image of Hazel laughing, her face dusted with flour. He caught himself staring at his hand, remembering the feel of her soft cheek beneath his thumb. He had enforced the contract. He had walked away. He had chosen the safety of his predictable life. And yet, his life felt utterly, irrevocably gray. Hazel reached for her phone, her fingers hovering over his number. She wanted to text him, to ask if he was okay, to tell him that the silence was unbearable. But the fear of rejection, the fear of confirming that the connection was only real for her, held her back. She deleted the unsent message. Brandon, in his office, picked up his phone. He typed out a message. "Thank you for a memorable week." He stared at it, realizing how cold and inadequate the words were. He deleted it. He had made his choice. He wouldn't compromise her control by reaching out. They were trapped in a loop of mutual fear. Hazel finally pushed the briefs away. She couldn't focus. She needed a distraction. Her eyes fell on the gift he had given her, the leather-bound sketchbook. She opened it, the smooth, thick paper a welcome texture against her fingers. She hadn't drawn in years. She picked up a charcoal pencil and, without thinking, began to sketch. The image that emerged was not a geometric pattern or a still life. It was the farm, the sprawling porch, the crooked fence line, the thick blanket of snow, and in the foreground, two small figures, the twins, laughing, pulling a sled up a hill, with a tall, broad-shouldered man helping them. She stared at the finished sketch. It wasn't just a drawing. It was a portrait of home, a home she hadn't realized she was missing until he had shown her what it felt like. A profound, hollow ache settled in her chest. She had chosen her career, her control, but the choice felt empty. The life she had built was no longer enough. She looked at the drawing of Brandon, his face animated and free. The man she had hired to be fake had shown her what was real. She closed the sketchbook, the realization a cold, hard stone in her gut. She had let the best part of her life walk away at the stroke of midnight. 2 weeks after Christmas, the illusion of Hazel's perfect, controlled life shattered completely. She was in a high-stakes meeting with her senior partner, Mr. Henderson, discussing a massive corporate litigation case. Hazel had poured weeks of her life into preparing the defense, believing absolutely in the integrity of her client. Mr. Henderson, a man she had idolized as the epitome of legal success, was dismissive of her strategy. He was cold, arrogant, and clearly distracted. "Your passion is admirable, Collins," he sneered, tapping a pen against her meticulously prepared brief. "But you lost the case. We need to focus on damage control now." "I didn't lose the case, sir," Hazel countered, her voice tight with professional indignation. "The evidence was overwhelming. We should have won." "Evidence is fluid, Collins. Perception is everything," he said, his eyes avoiding hers. He then made a subtle yet damning comment about her lack of focus since the holidays, insinuating that her recent distraction was to blame for the loss. Later that day, a former colleague, now a disgruntled whistleblower, slipped Hazel an anonymous tip. The truth hit her with the force of a physical blow. Mr. Henderson had intentionally thrown the case, accepting a massive bribe to ensure the opposing side won. The entire firm was built on a foundation of corruption and unethical dealings. The disillusionment was total. The profession she had idolized, the fortress she had built her life around, was rotten to the core. The success she had chased so relentlessly was a lie. She thought of Brandon's words on the cold porch. "The true risk is living a life that is not your own." The old Hazel would have fought. She would have gathered evidence, filed a complaint, and launched a crusade to expose the corruption. But the new Hazel, the one who had laughed in a flower war and found comfort in vulnerability, felt a profound, liberating weariness. She walked into Mr. Henderson's office, her spine straight, her demeanor calm. "Mr. Henderson," she said, placing her resignation letter on his desk. "I'm done." He scoffed. "Done? Collins, you're on the partnership track. You can't just walk away." "I can," she stated simply. "I no longer wish to be a part of a system that values corruption over justice. And frankly, sir, I don't want to be a part of a life that leaves me feeling this empty." She turned and walked out, leaving the stunned partner and the high-powered firm behind. As the elevator doors closed, she felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. She had finally chosen herself over the illusion of success. Just as she stepped onto the street, her phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. She hesitated, then answered. "Hello? Advocate Collins?" The low voice on the other end sent a familiar jolt through her. "I was just wondering how the resource management was going. I'm thinking of taking a vacation, a long one, and I need to know if the best legal mind I know is available for a casual cup of coffee. No contracts. Just to check in." It was Brandon. Hazel leaned against the cold stone of the building, a genuine, relieved smile spreading across her face for the first time since Christmas. "I think," she replied, her voice soft but firm, "that I might just be available." The cafe was quiet, bathed in the soft mid-afternoon light. The atmosphere was light, yet the air between them vibrated with the intensity of their shared history. Brandon looked relaxed, dressed in casual clothes that somehow still looked expensive, his green eyes focused entirely on her. "You look different," Brandon observed, a hint of admiration in his voice. "Lighter." "I am," Hazel confirmed. She took a deep breath and told him everything. The corrupted case, the disillusionment, and the impulsive, liberating decision to quit her job. Brandon listened intently, not with the clinical analysis of a CEO, but with the genuine concern of a friend. "That took incredible courage, Hazel," he said when she finished, "to walk away from the fortress you built. I'm proud of you." His approval meant more to her than any praise she had ever received from a senior partner. "And you?" Hazel asked. "What about the dreadfully dull life of a tech investor?" Brandon smiled, a genuine warm smile that reached his eyes. "I realized that my life wasn't boring, it was safe, and safety without joy is just a gilded cage. I've spent the last 2 weeks trying to figure out how to dismantle the cage without losing my mind." He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Being at the farm, seeing the way your family lives, the chaos, the laughter, the real connection, it was a revelation. I realized I don't want to spend the rest of my life optimizing algorithms. I want to build things that matter, that connect people." He paused, then delivered his proposal, not as a contract, but as an invitation. "I'm taking a sabbatical, a long one. I'm going to travel for a month, maybe more. No schedule, no meetings, no goals, just adventure. And I need a travel partner." He looked directly into her eyes, his gaze challenging her old need for control. "I'm not proposing a relationship, Hazel. Not yet. I'm proposing an adventure partnership. No labels, no expectations, just two people who need to rediscover what it means to be alive. You need to find out what you truly want to draw, and I need to find out what I truly want to build. Want to come?" The offer was reckless, impulsive, and completely against every logical fiber of the old Hazel. A month of unstructured travel with a man who had already proven he could shatter her carefully constructed world. But the new Hazel, the one who had embraced the flower war and quit her high-paying job, felt a thrill of pure, unadulterated excitement. "Where would we go?" she asked, a wide, genuine smile spreading across her face. "Anywhere," Brandon replied, his eyes sparkling. "We'll flip a coin." Hazel laughed, a sound so free and bright it surprised them both. "I accept the terms of the adventure partnership, Mr. Brandon," she said, reaching across the table to lightly touch his hand. He didn't pull away. He simply closed his fingers around hers, a silent, warm promise of the journey ahead. "Good," he said, his voice husky with relief. "Because I already booked the first flight. We leave tomorrow." Hazel, the former lawyer who planned everything 6 months in advance, felt a wave of exhilarating panic. She had finally opened herself up to the beautiful, unpredictable messiness of life. A month later, the scene was dramatically different. Hazel and Brandon were on a secluded beach in the Mediterranean, the sun setting in a riot of orange and pink over the turquoise water. Hazel was sitting on a blanket, sketching furiously in the high-quality notebook Brandon had given her. She was tanned, relaxed, and her eyes held a spark of joy that had been absent for years. The adventure had been everything they needed. They had navigated crowded markets, hiked ancient ruins, and shared quiet, honest conversations under foreign stars. They had learned each other's rhythms without the pressure of performance. Hazel had discovered her true passion. She didn't want to be an artist. She wanted to connect people to the beauty of the world. She had spent the last week outlining a plan for a boutique travel agency focused on immersive, culturally rich experiences. Brandon approached her, carrying 2 glasses of local wine. He was wearing linen pants and looked more grounded and content than she had ever seen him. "What are you drawing?" he asked, sitting beside her. "The next chapter," she replied, showing him her sketch. It was a logo for her new agency. "It's brilliant, Hazel," he said, his admiration clear. "I knew you had the vision. And I know you have the capital," she teased. "I'm going to need an investor." Brandon chuckled, taking her hand and bringing it to his lips. He kissed her knuckles, his green eyes serious. "I am an investor, Hazel," he said, his voice low and intense. "And I know a valuable asset when I see one. You are too valuable for me to lose." He set down his wineglass and turned fully toward her. The playful banter was gone, replaced by a profound, terrifying sincerity. I spent my life trying to minimize risk. I wrote a contract to protect myself from the possibility of love. And the moment I walked away from you at midnight, I realized that I had minimized everything except the risk of profound unhappiness. He reached into the pocket of his linen shirt and pulled out a small velvet box. Hazel's breath hitched. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic, beautiful rhythm. I know this is fast, he continued, his voice thick with emotion. I know we just finished an adventure partnership, but I don't want to go back to the gray, Hazel. I want to wake up to your chaos, your laughter, and your honesty every single day. He opened the box. Inside was a ring, simple, elegant, and timeless. Our first agreement had an impossible clause. I want to propose a new contract, one with no expiration date, no conditions, and no need for performance. He looked up at her, his love shining brightly in his eyes. Will you marry me, Hazel? For real this time? Will you be my partner in life, my co-conspirator in chaos, and the only clause I ever need? Tears streamed down Hazel's face, tears of pure, unadulterated joy. The fear of control was gone, replaced by the certainty of love. Yes, she whispered, her voice choked with happiness. Yes, Brandon. 1,000 times. Yes. He slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. He pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a depth of emotion that sealed their new permanent agreement. 1 year later, the scene was back at the farm. It was Christmas Eve, and the house was even more chaotic than before. Hazel and Brandon, now married, were watching the twins try to attach a string of lights to the roof of the barn. Hazel's travel agency, The Uncharted Path, was thriving. Brandon was her silent, supportive partner, having found his joy in building her dream. As the family gathered for dinner, Brandon pulled Hazel aside. I have one last piece of business, he said, a mischievous glint in his eye. He pulled out a small folded piece of paper, a cocktail napkin from the cafe where they had their first check-in. Our final contract, he said, handing it to her. She unfolded it. In his sharp, decisive handwriting, he had written, the final clause, Party A, Brandon, and Party B, Hazel, hereby agree to prioritize chaos, laughter, and genuine affection over control, logic, and fear every single day for the rest of their lives. No exceptions. No regrets. Below it were their signatures. Hazel laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated happiness. This is the best contract you've ever written, Mr. Callister. He pulled her close, kissing her under the mistletoe that Nancy had strategically hung in the doorway. Binding for a lifetime, Mrs. Callister, he murmured against her lips. Their story had started with a desperate lie to escape the pressure of expectations. It ended with a simple, honest truth. The greatest adventure is finding the person who makes you brave enough to live your own life.